I do want to thank you all for joining us today. I am Jasmine Garrett here with the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. Today's session is an informational overview on the Construction Inflation Fund. A quick housekeeping note, we do suspect that many questions will be answered in today's presentation. However, you are able to write in questions at any point during the presentation using Zoom's Q&A feature. It is one of your Zoom command options, and it will allow us to make sure we are able to get back to you and let others see these questions and answers as well. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted on our NJEDA and YouTube pages. The slides and other resources will also be available in the next few days. Now, to get us started with the presentation, I will shift things over to NJEDA's Director of Real Estate Programs, Liza Nolan. Liza?
Yes, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. We want to welcome you to this information session. And for a quick overview, I'll turn it over to Dan Jennings, and then I'll take time and go through some of the application or the program details, eligibility, and other requirements. Dan?
Thank you, Liza. So good morning, Dan Jennings. I'm the EVP of Real Estate Development and Programs for the EDA. Welcome. So we're going to present the Construction Inflation Fund today, and it's one of the new tools or one of the several tools that's in the state budget this year. The purpose of this program is to find projects or to support projects that are stalled because of the pandemic. So as many of us know, a number of projects that were conceived before the pandemic, in the early part of the pandemic, suffered cost increases, particularly the spike in construction materials. So we, as some of you may know, HMFA started a similar program about a year or so ago, the Supply Chain Disruption Program, to support projects that have been awarded tax credits, but unfortunately stalled. So we are basically borrowing from that program to start this program. And we're looking for a variety of projects, and Liza will explain those projects in just a minute. We are using federal funds, some of the COVID dollars that the state received as the source of this, as the funding source for this program. So like all federal funds, there will be emphasis on documentation to prove that your project has stalled. And we'll get into those details a little later. So without further ado, I want to again thank you for attending today's information session. I'm going to turn it back over to Liza Nolan to give you the details.
Thank you, Dan. So I am going to go through a slide presentation. As mentioned earlier, Jasmine mentioned, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or hold them till the end, because hopefully we'll go through the various details of the program and answer at least some of them as I walk through these slides. So as Dan mentioned, the key part of this is that we are using federal American Rescue Plan funds through the, I guess it's around $380 million that the state of New Jersey got as part of the coronavirus local and state and local federal fiscal recovery funds. The projects that we're hoping we will be funding, and our board has approved the allocation of the $10 million for this pilot program, are real estate projects of at least $5 million total project costs. There are other funds that EDA has made available for smaller projects, for small businesses impacted by the pandemic. So this is devised to hit projects of at least $5 million total project costs. The types of projects would be commercial, office, manufacturing, or mixed use developments. As those of you who have worked with EDA know, EDA can fund mixed use development projects, including residential. but there is a affordability housing requirement that must be adhered to. We are allowing manufacturing projects here, but we are not going to be funding just pure industrial or warehouse or 100% retail projects. There may be a part of a manufacturing or other project that has a warehouse component or a use, but that would be ancillary. This program does utilize federal funds, and as such, prevailing wage is a requirement. If a project has started construction, it would only be eligible if the contract's in place and documentation is provided for the use of prevailing wage or Davis-Bacon during the construction incurred so far. As mentioned, we have $10 million available. It is a grant program. The grant funding would be determined based on the cost increase and the funding gap that is related to the pandemic impact. The minimum funding we would be providing per project would be $500,000, maximum funding of $5 million. Also, we would do a calculation. The funding cannot exceed 20% of the total project costs. There is an application fee, the standard EDA fee of $1,000. Eligible applicants. So federal funding requires for the COVID impact that you have eligible applicants as well as meet other eligibility requirements. So the applicants would be determined or be considered as small businesses undertaking an eligible real estate development project. So typically a real estate development company. We do have here and also in the board memo and the information on our website what a small business is defined on in order to meet the federal funding requirement. As explained here, a small business is eligible if it experienced negative economic impacts, hence the project that they are trying to undertake was impacted by COVID, by cost increases, by a funding gap. They also need to have no more than 500 employees. And under Section 3 of the Small Business Act, they're determined to be a small business concern, which basically means they are independently owned and not deemed nationally dominant in their field of operation. For all EDA programs, we do requirement that the company be registered to do business in New Jersey and be in good standing with Department of Labor and Department of Environmental Protection. Tax clearance will be reviewed if approved, and we will undertake a federal debarment review, a system of award management check as part of the federal funding requirement. Some of the other federal considerations, and this program is fitting a need out there, but there is a limited number of projects that may be eligible to be considered because of balancing the requirements out there with some of the program limitations. As mentioned, and we'll talk about in the application, that you must demonstrate the COVID impact. Usually that would be done with construction cost price increase documentation. The project must demonstrate the funding gap. Some of you are familiar with various federal programs that require cost reasonableness review, as well as subject to duplication of benefits. This program cannot replace other federal funding that you might have received. So we will have part of this information will be submitted by the applicant during the application process, the online application process, and then the cost reasonableness will be done once we receive the construction documentation, and we will take that under review as part of the approval process. the American Rescue Plan funds do have timelines associated with them, so we must obligate the funds, approve projects by the end of 2024, and the project funding must be expended by the end of 2026. So as part of the application, we will be requiring a project development timeline to make sure that the projects can be expended by that deadline. As mentioned previously, this is a program subject to prevailing wage and other labor standards compliance, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So how would you apply if you are interested in this? It's an online application. Some of you may be familiar and have submitted in the past the EDA common application for various program funding. So typically you would go online, there is a common application, entering information here, guiding you through the initial documentation about the applicant and the project location and other requirements. And then we would have our own separate sections, most of which would be uploads, as in a typical real estate development project application, where you would provide information as outlined here. One of them that is required, and I'm going to go through the ones that are highlighted on this screen, are the narrative describing the COVID impact and the related cost increases. We would like a narrative. We'll also require the project budget and construction documentation related to that, as well as a narrative describing 2 capital expenditure alternatives that you might have considered as part of this when you were faced with the COVID increase. That will be outlined, and there is a reference connection to that on the website. This is a federal program requirement that we must document as part of the reporting to the federal government treasury. This program, again, is to address projects, as Dan described, that were started in project planning during or right before COVID, impacted by cost increases and funding gaps. So in addition to the project budget, pro forma cash flow, we will have you submit the evidence of the financing that you have in place, the construction contract documents, and evidence of efforts to reduce costs. And we'll talk about that as part of kind of the scoring and review process. Again, the projects were in process, in planning, and so we would ask you to provide the documentation of where the local review approvals permits that you had in place. Again, you might have received them, costs increased, or time elapsed due to the pandemic and the stalling of the project, and so those might have changed, but we would request the documentation of that to show that this was a project that was started or impacted due to COVID and pandemic-related issues. Project development timeline, as I mentioned, we have to assure that the project can be completed per the federal funding expenditure timeline, and general applicant organizational documents. Again, this would demonstrate that you're eligible as a small business. You would fill out your information related to the business, the applicant, and location, NAICS code, and other information. And then the experience and capacity to undertake such a project. And then as part of this, again, because we are doing this as a grant and a gap financing, we do require that there is a commitment to defer at least 50% of the developer fee. The application information and documentation relates to the scoring. This is a competitive application. It is a grant program. It'll be an online application that's open for at least 60 days Once the deadline to submit the applications has passed, all the applications will be reviewed against the scoring criteria outlined here in order to be considered for funding. And this is common among many EDA programs. A minimum score of 65 must be reached. The scoring is broken down based on available points or percentages, project proposal, describing the community economic growth impact, the benefits of the project, 25 points, project feasibility, cost effectiveness. Again, this is where you would indicate not just the cash flow pro forma projections, but also any efforts made to reduce costs here, and 5 points specifically related to efforts to reduce costs. Readiness to proceed, again, this is COVID related, so we're trying to fit the need to move projects forward as quickly as possible. So that would be up to 35 points there, and experience and capacity, 20 points. We do have up to 4 points as a bonus based on location of the project and/or participation by New Jersey certified woman, minority, or veteran-owned business enterprises as part of the construction or project development. Where is the program at right now? Our board did approve the program, and the board memo and the program specifications are on our website, detailing in more specifics what I just described here. That was approved by our board in December. Today, we're holding the information session to hear questions and to also get market awareness about the program. We are also working on the application. We do not have the date yet, but it will be coming up in spring. As mentioned, it will be an online application. The program does allow for us to accept the applications and to ask for clarifications or missing information. So you would be provided with a short time period to submit any documentation that was not submitted, and therefore the application would be deemed incomplete. We would undertake a completeness and kind of federal funding eligibility review initially, and then all the applications that meet those requirements would be reviewed by an evaluation team and scored. These projects would each require board approval by EDA's board, and then once approved, we would go to a grant agreement. The grant agreement would provide the funding amounts as well as detail the federal requirements or other program requirements. Because this is a prevailing wage and does have other requirements involved in it, we would have project monitoring to oversee construction. The disbursement would be based on the construction schedule. It would be flexible depending on what the other funders are providing or how they are dispersing their funds. And then we would wrap it up and provide the final approval and disbursement at completion. For information, we do have an email box set up that we'll share here in the screen, as well as we'll refer you to our regular website here. Once we are ready to proceed with the program launch, we will also have posted program questions, kind of frequently asked questions session or information documentation. Some of it might be coming out of this session or other areas which we want to provide further clarification on that we did not do during the board memo, which is more of a summary. So that's the overview of the program. I can go into questions specific to different components, whether about the applicant or the project details or timing. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
So Liza, we do have one question in the chat, and that's, are nonprofits eligible?
Okay, am I on here? Yes. So this program requires that you be a small business as defined under the statute for the ARP funding. So a nonprofit would not be eligible for that. Other questions or comments?
I think that's it. There's no questions in the Q&A. All right.
Okay.
Nope, there's no questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Are there, we hope that there are potential projects out there that will be able to apply for the program, either from the group here, or we also have had others follow up following this establishment of the program. If going forward there are questions, you can send them to the real estate info at NJEDA.
Liza, we did get one question. Do projects need to be fully completed by 12/31/26 or just the funds spent?
I'm guessing the person who's asking that question is familiar with CDBG and federal funding requirements, because expended does not mean always the project fully completed. Typically, it means that the projects have to be expended given to the applicant. Since, however, this is a construction development program, and will be monitoring it for compliance with the labor standards compliance, we would expect that the projects would be completed by that time. So I'm giving a little wiggle room there, and I'm guessing the person does know that technical definition of expended.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We do have another question. What do you think average grant size will be and how many projects funded?
Dan, do you want to pipe in on that?
Sure. So I think we're looking for at least 2 to 3, possibly more. So one of the things we've done is we designed this program so that we can, give out smaller amounts, and then we can give out like 1 or 2 larger amounts. We know that $10 million is not a lot of money, so we're looking at this more as a pilot. So if there's a lot of demand, there's a chance we can get more money in the budget so we can, do this again.
And as mentioned, the minimum would be 500,000 that we're giving per project, and the maximum is 5 million per project. So that fits in with the parameters that Dan described.
So we do have another question. We are a nonprofit building 148 condo development with 20% affordable units. Is there another program for us?
So Liza, I want to say, I think Liza gave the technically correct answer, but we'll verify that a nonprofit is not eligible. You do raise a good point. Part of the challenge with federal funds and COVID dollars in particular is you generally have to meet one of the eligibility criteria. So in this case, the applicant has to be defined as a small business and fit that sort of SBA federal definition. So that's kind of the hard part. It's not something that we initially wanted to do. We wanted it to be a little bit more open-ended, but because of the nature of the funds, we had to unfortunately follow this quirky rule.
Mm-hmm. We can follow up with the person who asked the question about the nonprofit developing condo units with affordable percent. We'll follow up in a separate email.
All right, we do have one additional question. Will you be eligible for the program if you are seeking other EDA funding as Aspire?
So the challenge with that is that this program, again, with the federal requirement and the COVID direct impact, has to be a project that is in process, has to have started during COVID. And by started, I'm being a little open-minded here. It's not started construction necessarily, but it is definitely started planning, permitting, financing. And so Aspire, you have not submitted, I'm guessing, for the Aspire program. Or if you were already awarded Aspire as it's coming out, you already have all your funding. So I won't say completely no, but it would not be very likely due to trying to make sure that the project was started and impacted by COVID and you had the funding gap and could demonstrate that. Hopefully that answers the question. But Aspire is a program coming out, is out there for various residential and other projects.
Thank you, Liza. Looks like all of the questions for today in the chat. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. All right. If you have any additional questions, please put them in the chat.
Okay.
All right, I think we're good. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact realestateinfo@njeda.com. And I want to thank you all for joining us today and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all for attending.